Before I tell you what happened on this mountain, there's one detail you need to keep in mind. Because the mountain didn't collapse, it didn't move, it never touched them. 7 experienced hikers went to sleep in sub-zero temperatures inside their own functioning tents, with food, firewood, and proper winter gear. And sometime during the night, all 7 of them decided that staying inside their tent was more dangerous than running barefoot into the dark. They cut their way out of their tents and ran. When rescuers arrived, they found the tents still standing, their supplies untouched, and the boots still inside, lined up neatly, like the hikers planned to come back. They never did. I'm Detective Cassandra Maddox, and this mystery follows 7 hikers who never made it home. And 12 years later, no one can still explain why. On December 6th, 2013, sometime after midnight, something changed. There's no exact time because no one survived to tell it. But based on weather conditions and the state of the campsite, investigators believe the hikers were asleep when the chaos began. What woke the hikers wasn't a storm. There was no avalanche or animal attack. Instead, the first sign of trouble is found in the tents themselves. Rather than using the zippers, the hikers cut their way out. Multiple slashes appear along the side of each tent canvas, uneven and frantic. After they got out, they ran. 7 sets of footprints led away from the tents and down the mountain. All of the footprints were barefoot, and inside the tents, their supplies were still there. Food, coats, flashlights, and their boots. Every pair was still inside, placed neatly near the opening. The 7 hikers were not found together, and that became clear as soon as search teams began following the trail away from the tent. Instead of leading to one location, the footprints stretched down the mountain and slowly broke apart, eventually revealing 3 separate groups of bodies scattered across the slope. The first 2 were discovered near the edge of the tree line, less than a mile from the campsite. Both were lightly dressed. Neither was wearing shoes, and the snow around them was undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle and no marks on their bodies that suggested anyone else had been there. It looked as though they had simply collapsed mid-escape, frozen in place before they ever had a chance to reach shelter. Farther down the mountain, searchers came across the remains of a small fire. Someone had taken the time to build it carefully, arranging stones and feeding it enough wood for it to last. At some point, the fire had been lit, but just as suddenly, it had been abandoned. 3 bodies were found nearby, close together, as if they had stayed near the warmth for as long as they could. One of them was kneeling in the snow, head tilted slightly upward, as though listening or waiting for something. The final 2 hikers were found farther away from the others, separated and higher up the slope. They were wearing more clothing than the rest, but something was clearly wrong. There were no visible wounds, no broken bones, and no signs of impact. But when doctors examined their bodies, they found extensive internal damage, organs completely shredded, injuries that didn't match a fall or exposure. Whatever caused it hadn't left marks on the outside. By the time all 7 had been recovered, one thing was clear. They hadn't all died the same way, and they hadn't stayed together. Whatever drove them out of the tent scattered them across the mountain, and it didn't stop affecting them once they ran. Over the years, people have blamed the cold, the wind, even mass hallucination. But there's one piece of evidence that never fit any of those explanations, because months later, the first rescuer to reach the scene took his own life, and the only thing he left behind was a note that said, "It wasn't the cold, it was the sound." For investigators, the note raised more questions than it answered. The mountain was known for strong winds, but nothing about the weather reports from that night stood out as unusual. There had been no storms, No recorded events, nothing that explained why 7 experienced hikers would abandon their shelter and flee into the dark. But for the people who lived nearby, the note felt uncomfortably familiar because of the sound. Locals had a name for it, though no one seemed eager to say it out loud. They described it as a kind of wind that didn't behave like wind should. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't constant. It came and went, sometimes lasting only a few seconds, sometimes much longer. People said you didn't hear it so much as feel it, a pressure in your chest, a vibration behind your eyes, a sense that something was nearby, even when there was nothing to see. Those who claimed to experience it said it caused confusion and panic for no clear reason, like an instinct kicking in without a source. Several locals mentioned that animals tended to leave the area before it happened. Birds disappeared. Larger wildlife migrated early. Dogs refused to go outside. There was no proof of any of this. No recordings, no measurements. Just stories passed around quietly, usually after being asked directly. And the stories were all the same. But there was one discovery that never made it into most retellings of the case. It came from the area where the final 2 hikers were found. They were the ones with the most severe injuries, no visible wounds, but extensive internal damage that doctors later said looked more like the result of a violent impact than exposure. Near their bodies, partially buried in the snow, searchers found 3 knives. They were standard hiking knives, the kind carried for food prep or cutting rope. Nothing unusual about them, except for the fact that all 3 were smeared with blood. They weren't broken. They weren't bent, and they weren't found in anyone's hands. They were lying a short distance away, as if they had been dropped or thrown aside. When the knives were tested, investigators expected to find fingerprints. They didn't. Just blood, and no clear explanation for how those knives could be connected to injuries that showed no external cuts. If these hikers had turned on one another, there should have been clear signs: cuts, slashes, defensive wounds. Instead, their injuries told a different story, one where the knives were present, but almost irrelevant. Props in a scene that suggested violence, without actually delivering it. Almost like someone, or something, wanted investigators to think this was human conflict. Because if the knives weren't used, if no fingerprints were left behind, and if the injuries couldn't have been caused by human hands, then the most chilling question wasn't who held the knives. It was why they were there at all. The official report didn't dwell on the knives for long. They were logged, photographed, then quietly set aside, like an uncomfortable detail no one wanted to stare at for too long. Because once investigators accepted that the knives hadn't been used as weapons, they were left with a far worse realization. The hikers hadn't been attacked in any way that made sense. No struggle, no fight, no moment where things turned violent between them. Instead, everything about the scene suggested coordination, shared urgency, a group of people reacting to the same invisible trigger at the same exact moment. The case was eventually closed, filed under environmental factors, extreme stress, and group disorientation, a collection of explanations that sounded reasonable on paper but hollow everywhere else. All we know is that these hikers ran. What they ran from and why was never determined. If you're still here, you're one of the curious ones. Stick around. The next mystery's already waiting.